like I said with the music industry, given the size of it, I probably wouldn't say there are too many, just simply because each of those kind of different asset managers, investment consultants, whatever, they kind of offer something different, unique.
Welcome to The Portfolio, WTW's investment podcast series aimed at institutional investors, industry professionals, and enthusiasts alike.
Hello and welcome to the Portfolio Investment Podcast with me as your host, Lockmar. We've got a cross-collaboration episode today with the hosts of another podcast. It's called Oh No You Didn't. What a great name, by the way, gents. We'll introduce your podcast properly later, but for now, I'm delighted to have the three hosts of Oh No You Didn't with us today. James Ockley, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Daniel Austin Chukwu, great to have you too.
Hey, look, happy to be here.
Now, both James and Daniel are recent joiners to the WTW investment business in the UK. And we also have the third host from the same podcast, Fred Afrifa. You're not part of the WTW family yet, but I welcome you equally warmly.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. Look forward to it. Thanks for having us.
Cool. Now I know James and Daniel reasonably well, and I know the three of us have a shared interest in music. I know the same is true for you, Fred, as well. No surprise, because you guys are young and trendy, and I'm a 45-year-old actuary trying to pretend to be young and trendy, which is, of course, the same thing. And on and off, we've been talking and comparing the music industry with the investment industry, and we were starting to draw some interesting parallels and contrasts between the two industries, and we thought, actually hold that thought, that sounds like a podcast conversation, and so here we are. And so I've thought a little bit about a format. So what I'm going to do, gents, is I'm going to put forward three controversial, provocative statements out there about the music world first, and see how you feel about those statements, if you agree or disagree. And then we're going to explore whether the same applies with the investment world as well. So hopefully that's clear. Basically, think of it as a bit of a kind of pub conversation, if you like. So let's start. Statement number one, and let's start with you first, James. And I'll give each of you a chance to comment. So statement number one, music was better back in the day. So you hear something on the radio and you say, they don't make music like they used to anymore. James, true, false, or somewhere in between?
I think somewhere in between for me. I think it's a difficult question to answer because you can't really say a song is good or bad because everyone got different taste, right? So
Yeah.
what I might think is not good, you might love. But I think if I look back, music back in the days, and I'm talking like R&Bs, and we can even go further back, 1970s with the Queen, etc. There was a lot more good songs in the sense that when people release songs, it's like, 9 out of 10 of those songs were good songs. I feel like nowadays is a bit of the opposite. So I tend to find good songs, obviously, still, but it's very hard for me to think, oh, wow, this is a song that in 10 years' time I can still listen to. But then again, it's difficult because for me, I like the beat. So obviously, I play the drums. So when I listen to a song, I listen to the beat, I listen to the drummer, I listen to the bass, and I just like to listen to the beat. So recently, I watched Bohemian Rhapsody, for example, movie by the Queen, and just the way they made music back then, and just looking at that, I was amazed by it, and I thought, yeah, this is great. And I don't think that happens in that way. I think we still have artists that operate that way, but a lot less than what we did back then.
All right, fair enough. So I think what you're saying is kind of the proportion of hits were higher back then. That's where you're coming from. Moving over to you, Daniel, where do you stand?
Probably in a similar camp to James. I'll kind of be 50-50 in the sense that obviously when I think back to like kind of the 90s and the noughties, I think of kind of the music that was released more specifically like kind of hip hop, R&B, that kind of stuff. And I kind of felt that at the time it was just more creative. You had more original sounds. All the different artists had their own kind of unique sound. Because I'll listen to a song from back then and I'll be like, okay, there's not like a single song that sounds even remotely similar to that. Whereas now, for example, there's a genre I listen to called drill. So it's like UK drill. It's like a mixture of like hip hop and kind of garage kind of vibes. And you listen to certain songs, and although I still like all the songs, they will sound very similar because you've got like very similar drum patterns, very similar kind of flow of the artist. So like I would say artists now sound a lot more similar. They still produce very good music, I still think, but they just sound so much more similar today than I would say back in like the 90s and the 2000s.
Yeah, and I did do a tiny bit of research into drill music before this. I mean, it's not just drill. I mean, I have noticed that a lot of genre music, and I get most of it through YouTube, right? And there seems to be people are quite protective about the rules of how they make that particular type of beat. There's like people have a go. So I know drill has got like the really quick hi-hats and the kind of sparseness in the middle and then the big kick drums and stuff. And people would comment like, "Oh, that's not drill," or that is odd. Yeah, you got it authentic or you haven't. So people are quite protective about how it should sound, and that potentially takes a bit of the variety out of it a little bit. Throwing it over to Fred. Music used to be better back in the day. True or false?
Yeah, I disagree. I think it's false. I think first of all, I just think good music lasts the test of time. So when we're listening to music back in the day, we're just listening to the hits, to what was good back in the day. I'm sure that if we were in the 80s, there would also be other songs that were just rubbish, but they just didn't last the test of time, so we don't listen to it now. Same way in 10 years' time, people are going to only listen to like the top songs of this era and say, oh, that was fantastic. But they wouldn't be aware of the songs that weren't good because they won't last the test of times. So that's one thing that I think tricks us into thinking that old school songs were better, because we hear the hits, but then we don't hear the ones that were rubbish because they didn't make it. So that's one thing. Secondly, I just think that music is kind of just music, and each generation is going to think that their way of doing it was great. So like I grew up listening to 50 Cent, for example. So I think he is one of the greatest of all times. And a kid growing up now is going to think Stormzy is one of the greatest of all time just because that's what he grew up on. Same way my dad's generation will think Tupac's the greatest of all time because that's what he grew up on. So I think it's like a generational thing where there will always be there will always be good music. But number one, the music we hear now from the 80s is just the good stuff. So we think that it was all good stuff. There were probably bad stuff. And then number two, it's just a generational thing of each generation just has their quote unquote goats and they just carry on with that gen.
Yeah. And I think of the three of you, I think, James and Dan, you're a bit 50-50. I'm closer personally to where Fred is. I absolutely agree. I think what you're describing is survivor bias. The songs that you hear from the old days are the good ones. There's a massive danger of taking the very best music from your youth, the classics, and then comparing that with whatever garbage happens to be coming out of the radio at the time. And it's not like necessarily a fair comparison. So I mean, my own view, I get a lot of my enjoyment from like the production side of the song, how it's put together, kind of as much as the musicality and the emotions and the sentiments and whatnot. Interesting, James, you're talking about like the drum beats. For me, the specialization of beat making nowadays, basically, essentially, like the backing track that people sing on top of. To me, the specialization of that as a skill's taken pop music, at least, for me, to greater heights. So I think actually I'd probably enjoy music now more than I used to. But let's make that shift into smoothly to the investment world. So for me, the statement of things were better back in the day, that's just not true. The investment portfolio of today is far more sophisticated, far better kind of risk managed compared to something from 10, 20 years ago. We've seen people adopting some really important ideas around diversifying your return streams, the idea of lining up the economic exposures of your assets and liabilities. And I know that this idea of LDI is in the news a lot at the moment, at least in the UK. I'm sure that's a future episode, so let's just park that thought. Other things like the idea of having explicit mechanisms to protect against bad events, adaptations as markets evolve, night and day compared to the simple equity portfolios of the past. And I have an ex-colleague, and his kind of derogatory remark about when he sees a bad portfolios, he would say, well, that's a bit 1990s, or that's a bit 2000s. So I think, we as an industry do think our techniques have improved in a much more pronounced way than the music industry.
Yeah, just to kind of jump on what you've said, Locke, in terms of whether investments were kind of better back in the day, obviously I'm still relatively new to the investment industry, but I would at the same time say no. And kind of one example I would think of is kind of the role that technology and automation is now playing in investments. And just a simple example related to what we do here, we have a software which basically allows us to daily monitor the portfolios, and they like kind of live update the information. And obviously that kind of data and that kind of technology was just not simply available 10 years ago, and it makes our lives so much easier now. I imagine someone in 20 years ago, how would they have coped? So yeah, just the role of technology in itself today has made investments, I would say, not far better, but makes it easier to manage and easier to track than probably kind of in yesteryear.
It's interesting, really. I think on the flip side of that, if we look at recent events, right, and we look at the market and inflation rising, fear of a recession, and very volatile markets, can really say things are better. I'm not saying things are worse. Obviously, things are better because of technology, etc. But it does feel like we're making the same mistakes that we did in the past.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. But on the flip side as well, one thing that is in more focus, I would say today, within probably like the last 5, 10 years or so, is kind of things like ESG and IND. Maybe, 10 years ago, asset managers or investment consultants weren't having that in the back of their minds, but obviously now it's almost always factored into whatever decision we make. So I think the importance of ESG credentials today has made investments far more sustainable and far more just superior than I think they were kind of 5 years ago.
I think I agree with both of you, actually. I agree with James in that a lot of the problems we have are the same that we've seen in the past. But I would say that the tools we have for dealing with them are better nowadays. Also agree with Daniel, though. A lot of the things that we're thinking about now, people just didn't used to think about. So it's kind of a combination of those things. But anyway, let's move on to statement number 2. So back in the music world now, and this is about the availability of technology, and also the I'd call it like the socializing, the spreading of expertise, especially online on the internet. So is there, Daniel, less of a gap nowadays between the amateur artist and the professional artist? And by amateur, I'm not disparaging anyone. I just mean someone who doesn't publish their own music as a full-time career. What's the gap like?
I believe that the gap has narrowed between kind of the amateur and professional artists simply because now I feel like the access to equipment and technology is just far easier in today's era than it was in the past. For example, I actually used to make beats. Obviously, I have a laptop. I bought the software to make it, and then I bought the plugins necessary to make the sounds, and then I started making music. 20 years ago, for the average person, I just don't think that would simply be possible. And obviously now I feel like it's easier for amateurs to kind of sound more professional because obviously they have better access to better mics, more access to like better higher quality synthesizers used to make the sounds, the greater knowledge of like mastering and mixing, etc. So all of that combined, I feel like the gap is now narrowing between the amateur and professional, because sometimes I'll go on YouTube and I listen to just a beat that a so-called amateur has made, and I think this is amazing. And then you see songs that chart and you think to yourself, okay, the production does sound good, but how much different is it from that amateur? If you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do know the kind of improvement in technology. So back in my day, people who made music had to buy synths and they plug them in. They buy drum. Like what you guys know as the 808 was a machine back in my day, right? Some people had it and some people didn't. Whereas now, my son goes on, he uses Logic on the Mac, and it's got everything, like every sound you could possibly think of. So I think definitely technology has closed the gap a lot. Fred, what do you think?
Yeah, I do think technology has definitely closed the gap and made it narrower. But it's interesting how you guys are mainly coming from a production standpoint. As someone who kind of did music or kind of released his own music, I would still say that there are still pretty high barriers to entry to penetrate the market you know, to make that gap, because as an artist, the costs are still quite high. So you'd have to pay for the beats, you'd have to pay for the studio time, you still have to pay for the video, then you have to pay for promotions, which are things that if you're a professional artist, you probably have a label and a machine that's plugging you and pumping money into you, system a lot easier. So even though the gap has reduced, I think there is still quite a big gap if you haven't got the funds. You know, if you're just someone who is passionate about music and is trying to penetrate without quite a big capital, it is still quite difficult, and there is still quite a gap.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, there's the quality of the music, and then there's everything else around the music if you want as a career. Because one kind of game I kind of play with myself is I go on Spotify and I like listen to like pretty random stuff, and then I try to guess how successful that person is, and it's not easy to guess. There's some things that I think are absolutely amazing, and like, you know, there's someone who's got like 50 listens a week or something, and something that I think is a bit garbage becomes quite a kind of a mainstream success. So I kind of agree with you on that. James?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I guess if we're talking about technology and beat making, for example, then yeah, obviously, I think the gap is smaller. I think there's still a gap, but is a lot smaller. But I think in terms of, I don't know, quality of lyrics, for example, I feel like there's no gap. And also, I think it also depends how we define someone that is amateur and someone that isn't. Because is it just you being signed to a music label make you not amateur, or is it everything else? Because I think there's a lot of artists that are not signed that, for example, are doing very well for themselves, but are we considering them amateurs because they're not signed, or are they now professional in the music industry? So I think it just depends on what angle we look at. And also, we have so many tools like the internet where everyone can just go on YouTube now and learn how to make beats. Obviously, you're not going to be a beat maker in the space of the day, but like everything, practice made perfect. Someone can spend years on developing their craft and then becoming professional, as we say.
Yeah, so I kind of, again, I'm probably closest to where Fred is. That I still think there is quite a bit of a gap. I'm probably like looking more at pop music, and like you, I also go on YouTube and watch people make music in the studio. That is a thing on the internet, listeners. So mostly you see the talented amateurs, you know, they pick the sounds and blend them together, and you think, well, actually that could be on the radio, really. Some of the big name, the top professional producers also sometimes release videos. And for me, you really can see the difference in what the pros do. So they don't just take a sound, they know exactly how to craft it so that it sounds like what they want rather than what they have to hand. They think so much about how the different sounds fit together, like the frequencies, the use of, like, you know, reverb and effects and emphasizing what you want to hear. And you just get a sense of how much expertise you need to get to that top level. So again, because I care more about production than songwriting, I guess, I think that's where there's still a big gap between the amateur and the true pro.
Yeah, no, look, I would agree with that, but I wanted to just kind of send it back to kind of something that James said when he mentioned something about lyrics, and it got me thinking about how with professional artists, obviously there are some that lyrically are just second to none, but then there are others that, because they have such a unique sound, and obviously such a unique following, for the most part, it doesn't always really matter what they're saying, as long as the beat is vibey and the drums are hitting and the melody's good and everything like that. The lyrics can be bad, because there are even songs that I listen to, and I will admit this, there are songs that I listen to where the lyrics are just not good, but the reason why I still listen to that artist, because one, I like the sound, and two, just the beats that they use they're just very good beats. Whereas I feel like with amateurs, to almost break into the music scene even more, they have to kind of put more emphasis on the lyrics that they implement to make them sound more unique and just not sound like every kind of other artist.
Yeah, I think I agree and also disagree in a sense that generally the way people consume music in different ways, and I think the masses don't listen to lyrics, unfortunately. And as someone who's a lyricist myself, it's quite painful because sometimes a lot of these things will fly over people's heads, you know, and they will more so listen to how you said something than rather than what you said. And then another interesting thing is that I was listening to an interview from J5, who's like a big producer
Yeah.
as well, Burna Boy and J Hus. And actually he was mentioning how when he produces music, he will get someone to play the saxophone in front of him and record that. So we sometimes think that, oh, this is just like a sound from like Logic or one of these beat making things, but actually on a professional level, these producers will get someone they'll pay 20K for someone to blow the saxophone, or for someone to go in there and play the keys and play the guitar, and they kind of compose a whole thing with rhythm rather than just go on an app and put a beat together.
Yeah, I've always wanted to do a study on the progression of a flute session player's income against the rise of hip hop. Because I think if you can play the flute properly, you're doing very well for yourself. Probably I'm betraying my age here. So once again, moving on to the investment world, and again, I think in a similar way, technology has also been transformative, and arguably there's also less of a knowledge gap than before as well, because a lot of the technical stuff is potentially there on the internet if you know where to look, but I think there's still a big difference in terms of having the right scale of operation, your infrastructure and processes. So I think the same gap between the non-professional and the professional exists in investment as well, and a lot of it is down to, I think, specialization and collaboration. So when we run portfolios as a professional firm, you have lots of people who are experts in some aspects of looking after the portfolio, and we all work together to find the right solution for an investor. And we've got the resources to do the operational stuff through teams of people that are experts at the operational stuff. So very hard to replicate with a smaller setup, I would say. Again, kind of like the difference between your YouTube beat maker in the bedroom versus the kind of modern big budget pop song that's got multiple producers, writers, sound engineers, all coming together.
Yeah, no, I would echo that sentiment. I was just thinking in terms of like the kind of non-professional. Yes, they can still invest easily, but I feel like in the industry there are clear specialists that have, example, vast amount of experience. They have a proven track record. So maybe even someone like WTW may be able to invest better than other kind of investment management or even pension consulting firms, simply because they have that kind of long-standing history and reputation. So based off of that, they can kind of achieve kind of better performance.
The point you said about reputation, because what that does is it means people bring ideas to you as well. You don't have to go out, look everywhere. People go, I've got a good idea, I'm going to bring it to WTW or somebody else.
It's interesting. I think you guys may also be looking at it from a bigger scale investment standpoint. From someone who isn't in the investment industry, it seems as if it is a lot easier now to invest, because there are certain apps like Trading 212 or apps of that ilk. You can simply, put your money in an app and then invest in the S&P 500 or whatever different indexes. And it seems as though, from an amateur who's not in the industry, obviously I'm not talking about maybe the millions of the clients that you guys may have, but for the normal Joe, it seems as if the gap has closed quite a lot, because before we would have to consult a professional, whereas now you can simply go on an app and start investing.
I would echo that as well. I think in recent times you've seen examples with stocks of GameStop, for example. I don't know if you guys I heard what happened with that. We saw a massive increase in value over January, I think, and that was because amateurs investors, as we said, started buying stocks just to beat the hedge funds, right? And I think that just shows that there is the gap. I don't think the gap is as big as we think, and I think there's a lot of people now that are taking a more interest in investment, doing the research, and obviously not everyone is going to make the same amount of money as our big hedge funds, etc. But I think it's possible to have, I want to say, similar returns, but the gap is not as big as we think.
So I mean, definitely access much different than what it used to be. But the GameStop story is, for me, is about confidence in taking on the big guys, and this kind of internet versus hedge fund thing, which I found absolutely fascinating as well. Right, moving on. Finally, on to our third slightly controversial statement. This one's going to sound a little bit harsh, Fred, but are there too many artists in the music industry?
Interesting. I hear this often, and I don't think there are too many artists in the industry. My opinion is that there aren't enough. I think that the
Right.
reason people lament that music is the same is because there isn't enough diversity. And that would suggest that we need more artists with different ideas to do different things for everyone else. So I don't think there are too many artists. I think even though it does seem like a saturated place, I tend to have more of an abundance mindset where I believe that there is enough for everyone. So I think that more people actually should come forward and make music, you know, and make different types of music. So I don't think there are too many artists.
Good. What about you, James?
I'd probably back that sentiment, and especially because people listen to what they like, right? So there's so
Mhm.
many genre of musics. We listen to a genre of music, two genre of music, and we think there's too many artists making the same music. There's too many people making music, but music is massive. There's so many songs that you might never heard. There's so many genres that you might have never listened to. So how can we say that there's too many people in the music industry? We can't really. But I do think that for the music that I personally listen to, there's too many artists trying to sound the same, which is the problem that I found more than there's too many artists in general.
Great. What about you, Daniel?
Originally, when thinking about this question, I was thinking yes, because I was just thinking from the standpoint again from the music that I listen to, the hip hop kind of drill, UK rap, whatever, that kind of sub industry within music is just so saturated. I feel like it's just one of the most saturated kind of sub genres. But then at the same time, I started thinking, okay, it's not like, for example, the car industry where if one person buys, let's say, a BMW, it means they're not going to buy a Mercedes. Just
Yeah.
because one person listens to one artist, it doesn't stop them from listening to the other. The music industry is so big in itself and it's always going to keep expanding, which means that there is room for having more artists. So now that I think about it, I would kind of be similar to what James is saying in the sense that there's not too many artists, but there's too many artists trying to fit into kind of one particular sound or one particular just kind of group, and they feel like they need to differentiate a bit more.
Yeah, so back to this kind of need for authenticity, which I'm not sure is always helpful. But what you said, Daniel, just made me think. I think what you're saying is intricately connected to the idea of platforms. So Spotify means people can access, way more music than they ever used to. I'm from the era that, you hear a good song you like on radio, you go and buy the CD, 14.99. You realise that is the only song that you like from there and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, Fred.
It's interesting because I think one of the problems that artists face with the whole authenticity piece is that, like we said, that it is quite hard for an amateur person to make it pro. So an amateur would see what's working with the pros. For example, there is this sound that's popping. Okay, well, maybe this is the sound that I need to do to then also make it pro. And I think that dilutes the authenticity. So I think it's a little bit harder than we think for an artist to be super authentic because it takes a lot of bravery. If this is a sound that is not really mainstream, then to be the trailblazer is very difficult. And music is a thing where, like we've alluded to, whether you're good or not doesn't really matter. It just matters what the population thinks. So if the population thinks that certain style is similar, then that's what most artists are going to go for. I think that's what creates this kind of bottleneck where similar artists have a very similar sound.
Yeah, agreed. And I mean, related to the kind of platform and access point, I think whether you talk about the music industry or the investment industry, money is a massive driver for both of those. And the economic model for music is just brutal. You need 500,000 streams on Spotify a month to earn the equivalent of a minimum wage in the UK. So, in that sense, I personally feel like there are too many artists competing against each other for listeners just to make a decent living. But I'm totally with what you're all saying. Be the best or be different. So if you're a Taylor Swift or a Kendrick or something, you could do whatever you like. You're going to be massively successful whatever you do. If you're not one of these people, then try and do something in a different genre to those guys or bring something different.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Although it does seem like there are a lot of kind of asset managers or investment consultants today, but like I said, with the music industry, given the size of it, I probably wouldn't say there are too many, just simply because each of those kind of different asset managers, investment consultants, whatever, they kind of offer something different, unique. So maybe
Yeah.
they kind of focus on either ESG credentials or kind of focusing on specific asset classes, strategies, mandates, like I don't know, private debt or public debt, just things like that. They have their own different kind of niches and focuses, which means that they're all so different in their own unique way.
Yeah, agreed. And I mean, in the investment world, you've got the big ones. You've got the Taylor Swifts of investment houses, if you like. They've got, the big research teams. They've got the big processes. They spread their costs, across a big asset base. But there's still room, as you say, Daniel, for smaller specialist managers. Best in a more niche market. You deliver a return that's. I mean, you guys all said this word, diversifying, in the music sense, but of course it applies in the investment sense, delivering returns that are diversified away from the main players in the main market. So my ideal investment portfolio looks a bit like my Spotify playlist. It's got the big names, but it's also got, people who are very good in the less kind of mainstream areas as well.
I agree. And I think with the investment, it's hard to have too many kind of investment firms, and because the barriers to entry are so high, you need to be specialized, you need to have a lot of knowledge in the topic. Whereas I guess with the music, as we already discussed, the barriers aren't necessarily as big, and for you to be a big artist, it would be less work than it would for you to be a big asset manager.
Right, thank you. So we've compared the music and investment industries through these three slightly kind of controversial viewpoints. My quick summary for the investment world, there's been an improvement in techniques over time. I think that's pretty clear. There's still a difference between the non-pros and the pros. And it's hard to argue whether there are too many products, too many funds, but certainly, you to the extent that they're all too similar and doing the same thing, not as good. If you're offering something differentiated, then there's plenty of space for everyone. And finally, and don't anybody dare switch off now, this is, of course, a podcast with millions of listeners. I might be exaggerating a little bit there. So I hope this is a good platform for Daniel, James and Fred to attract some listeners for their new podcast. So can I please invite one of you to give us a quick introduction to this new podcast?
Yeah, so our new podcast is called the Oh No You Didn't podcast, and it's basically just kind of three guys just having casual conversation about topics or things that are going on that might seem a little controversial to talk about, or that the average podcast wouldn't think about talking about, simply because we might voice opinions that may not be the norm, or that quite a few people may, disagree with. But I think for us, it's just kind of having a casual forum just to kind of be ourselves, talk about things that happen every day, and like I said, about things that maybe not the average kind of person would potentially kind of talk about, and just see kind of what opinions we have. And obviously if people listen to it think, okay, we don't have the same opinion as you, then that's welcome. I guess we're just wanting to have a voice and just see what other people think.
I was just gonna add on to Daniel's thing that we'll speak about the things that people are too scared to talk about.
So thank you, and by the way, what an awesome name for the podcast. Oh no, you didn't. I kind of feel like you have to say it in a particular voice, like oh no, you didn't. Anyway, I was, as you know, a big fan of your previous show, the L Earning podcast, which is still on streaming services, I think, and I urge our listeners to check out the Oh No You Didn't podcast as well. In the meantime, I'm going to thank all three of you at the same time for your time today. James Ocklew, Daniel Austin Chukwu, and Fred Afrifa of the Oh No You Didn't podcast. Thank you very much for coming on.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks for having us, man. A pleasure.
Cheers. And I hope our listeners enjoyed our conversation as well. And until the next time, please take care.
You've been listening to a WTW podcast. For more information on WTW and the solutions we provide, visit WTWCO.com.